There are 13 days until the US election. Polls continue to be stubbornly tight and show no signs of changing. Today, rather than parse the polls, I do a deep dive into the last 30 years of US politics with my friend Andrew Naughtie. He's a journalist and writes the amazing Substack Memo from America. Today, we explore why Trump has such a stranglehold over the GOP, whether the race would still be tied regardless of who the Republican candidate was, why so many in the media underestimate Kamala Harris, and if her campaign is deliberately killing the vibe ahead of a big joyful push in the final week. Andrew and I also get into why Hillary Clinton was too good for us. I hope you enjoy our talk. Andrew, thank you very much for being a guest.
Happy to.
I'm going to start with my James Lipton questionnaire, US Politics edition. What is your favourite word?
My favourite word at the moment, because it does change, would be... I was thinking about this the other night. I don't actually know how to say it. I've heard two ways. My favourite word would be Byzantine or Byzantine as a criticism of an organisation. I love that word. I think it's... I'm probably using it wrong, and I'm probably saying it wrong, but I like writing it, so...
It is nice. What is your least favourite word?
Dynamic.
What is your favourite curse word?
Favourite curse word? I think people underrate bastard. Underrate that.
What moments in the campaign have prompted you to use it?
So many. I would argue most advance press conferences, most of those.
What sound or noise do you love?
Sound or noise? I like a very light, a kind of a light breeze, slightly whistling through an open window when you're tucked up very warmly in bed. That's nice.
Sound or noise do you hate?
ASMR. Hate it. I can't stand it. You know, people kind of rustling things and chopping things and, you know, doing this. It makes me... It's not even a sensory response. It makes me angry. I just want to shout, get on with it.
What is your favourite book?
My favourite book is a Gore Vidal novel called Myra Breckinridge from kind of the turn of the 70s, which I read at exactly the right age. It is absolutely bonkers, and it was made into an absolutely terrible film, but so terrible you kind of have to see it. But it's not even so bad it's funny, it's just demented. And it's quite offensive by today's standards in various ways. You could not write it now. But if you go in accepting that you're going to read some horrifying things, it is wonderful.
Did you see Best of Enemies last year?
No.
Oh, it was really good. It's about the TV debates between Vidal and William Buckley.
Oh, I did hear about this.
It was. I saw it when it was in the West End, and it was so good. Zachary Quinto is a very good Gore Vidal.
Good.
And also weird casting, but David Harewood is an excellent William Buckley.
Great. I mean, what a bastard, I would argue. Yeah.
And Myra Breckinridge comes up a lot in the play. There's like a Gore Vidal as evidence of Gore Vidal as a pornographer.
Yeah, depravity. Wonderful.
What is your favourite book about American politics?
Well, there are quite a few that you're meant to have read that I have not read, so I'm owning up to that. I read once. This is a very niche choice. I like books, political books that are about a very small event, rather than huge synoptic books like the LBJ thing, and partly because I have a very short attention span, but partly because it's sort of detail that I where I think the interesting thing is, there is a book about Hillary Clinton's first Senate campaign, which is called Hillary's Turn. It's not just about her, it's also about Giuliani dropping out and sort of New York politics at the time, pre-9/11 New York City politics. But it's a very, very good, and it's nice and short, it's about that thick. And it's just really forensic about how basically pre-internet, but post the explosion of money and the explosion of 24-hour news in politics happened. It reads as if it's from a completely different time, but everyone in it is someone you've still heard of. So it's of a weird vintage. But it's very interesting also. It was probably written in 2000. She was elected at the end of 2000. It was written within a year after it. So it's by someone who followed her during the campaign. And as a character study of her, it is interesting reading how people were writing about her at the time, because she has got this kind of palimpsest quality, because every few years everyone feels the need to reinterpret who she is. The version of her that had just been elected, but before 9/11, is very interesting. So that one would be mine. I can't remember the author.
And what is that image of her?
Well, it was her first time as a candidate, so finding her feet in that way. Genuinely struggling to express that she cared about anything, while genuinely very much caring about things most people don't care about. So it says this thing at the beginning: journalists found her incredibly boring and frustrating to cover because as soon as she talked to the media, bear in mind this is just after Lewinsky, whenever she talked to the media, she would completely seize up, and she hated them and hated being pulled apart by them, hated just being asked about Bill, all of it. So they found her very frustrating to write about. It's also not very interesting to write about her grasping and understanding and coming to genuinely care about the fact that people in upstate New York paid much more in energy bills than people in the city did, purely because of the way the market was badly structured. She has a facility for really granular and financial stuff. She's notoriously obsessed with the carried interest loophole. And there's a bit at the beginning, there's a vignette at the beginning where the guy writing the book gets to interview her somewhere during the campaign, and he talks about her being funny in a one-to-one conversation and doing an impression of the Three Stooges and cracking her knuckles and absolutely nailing it, and him thinking, who is this person? Where did this person come from? I've never seen this person exist in 10 years in national life. Obviously, she won the election, so there's no incentive for her to crack this out now, but journalists have completely misunderstood who this is. And to what extent is it her fault? That is a big part of the book. It's also very good about Giuliani and the craziness of his story, both in that campaign and prior to it, because it's before he got recast as the 9/11 mayor. But I'm more interested in kind of Hillaryology than an average person is or should be, so I would say that.
I mean, I've always thought something that's conveniently not talked about is that the attack lines that Trump used against Clinton were basically copy and pasted from the Sanders campaign, which were basically copy and pasted from the 2008 Obama campaign. And it was in a lot of people's interests in 2016 to forget that.
Yeah.
That the image being cast of Clinton in 2016, the negative image, was crafted by Obama in 2008.
Yes, and I think there is one element where I would say she and her campaign did open themselves up to this. I understand why it happened, is because there was this effort to clear the field for her and to remove the possibility that credible people would challenge her, and they didn't think Bernie would be a credible person. It created, again, the idea that she was running, assuming she had the privilege of inevitability, which was the fatal thing in 2008, because it made her campaign, the assumption was that she could run a boring campaign and become the nominee. And then when someone ran an exciting campaign, she had nowhere to go with it till it was too late. That's a crude read, but it is true of everything that happened in 2007. I think supports that reading of it. I think that the Obama lot in 2008, people forget how sexist that campaign was. And I would think the coverage of it was worse. But Obama himself said things that today in a Democratic primary would end you as a serious candidate. I remember during one interview he said, because the press were fawning over him at the time, he was asked something like, why do you think she's so nasty about you? And he said, well, it's tough running for president, let's be honest, and I think periodically when she's feeling down, she gets upset and says things she doesn't mean. Can you imagine if during the Democratic primary this time Biden had said that about Elizabeth Warren or Kamala Harris? These women are flying off the handle, but what do you expect from them? They're finding it difficult periodically. I don't think and I have to say, I am in the category that says, you shouldn't say things like that. You should know better than to say things like that. But I also think you are exhausted. Vocabulary is clunky. You probably regretted this. You hired the woman and gave her an incredibly important job, which you clearly respected her for her performance in. You have to think about what the actual important story is. But 2008 was such a different time in terms of what you could say about a woman. And it was an incredible step forward in an improvement of the acknowledgement of the difficulties of running for president while black, and the shocking treatment of Michelle Obama by an enormous array of people was a wake-up call for everyone. I think the stuff about how it treated women via Hillary took longer to catch up because she lost. I also think the frustrating thing, one of the frustrating things about 2008 in retrospect is, I mentioned this in a recent Substack, is that at the time people were furious that Hillary was quite openly toward the kind of, the third quarter of the actual primaries voting, was very open about saying white Americans in coal mining towns are being left behind. We have to stick up for them. And she was saying this in the context of running against what became the first black president. And she was talking about Appalachia and the South, and it was seen as not even a dog whistle, just fully racist. How dare she, how dare she, how dare she. She loses in 2016, and there is a full year of centre and left journalists saying the thing she failed to do is explicitly appeal to poor white people, and the only reason they're racist is because they're upset about something else. And if we tackle the something else, it will absolve them of their racism because they won't feel the need to think that way anymore. Exactly what she did in exactly the same places in many cases. Places that Obama then did not perform well in many cases. Memories are short. Journalists, after someone loses, want an explanation that is something they could have done rather than something that emerged during the campaign. It was a failure to do something, or it was an abdication of responsibility, or it was a botched analysis that they followed through too far and didn't adapt to. Some people are just racist, and that is true. And it's the same thing that happened here after Brexit. This sort of lassie style of political analysis that, oh my God, I think she's trying to tell us something. No, a lot of people thought immigration was higher than it was, were convinced that Turkey was about to join the EU and somehow kind of almost invade the country, when neither is true, they do have a responsibility to know better and to think better of other humans. That doesn't mean they weren't lied to. That doesn't mean Brexit, the campaign was an innocent one, fought in good faith, the Vote Leave campaign. It doesn't mean that we should excommunicate them from the electorate for making a horrible choice if you don't agree with Brexit. But it's not generous to people to say that they don't really believe what they believe, and that they actually have other problems they can't articulate, and it's our job to articulate them for them. That is a very patronising way of explaining away racist voting patterns, and it tends to come from people who believe you just can't say anything bad about anyone, whether it's they're poorer than you, or they're not white, or they live in a different place and you are so privileged to live in London or a coastal city in the US. Part of recognising people's worth and importance in humanity is taking them at their word, and by extension at their vote. 2008 was an example of people botching that, and then 2006, the post-game in 2016 was the same. And it's how Vance ended up getting pipelined into the establishment, basically, where he navigated his way to where he now is.
I mean, something that has always frustrated me about that narrative is that I think the stats after the 2016 election showed that actually the poorest voters voted for Clinton. And similarly in Britain with the referendum and then with Boris Johnson, these people in the sort of left behind places were often older, home-owning people, not the poorest in society.
Yeah, they weren't insecure and at the sharp end of austerity. They were people worried about inheritance tax.
And so it's like, it's just so frustrates me that both on the right and on the left of like a sort of, with the left, a sort of self-flagellating attitude of like, oh, we've left behind these places. And, it's all the fault of Tony Blair.
I remember a really frustrating thing I read after, it was either after the Brexit referendum or after the final collapse of Corbyn. And it was talking about people in London not understanding kind of red wally places in some very crude way. And it said this thing pointing out that people in London are more familiar, middle class and upper middle class people in London are more familiar with Berlin and Amsterdam than they are with Newcastle and Oldham. And the two things I thought about it were, this is quite a change, isn't it, from complaining that people who live in the north and are poor are using cheap flights to get to places and they're ruining the planet with it, and famously going all over Europe. And yes, they have been to these places and they are capable of travel. They're okay for that. And also, how well do people in Newcastle know Oldham? Like the idea that there is a sort of pan-northern consciousness and that northern people are a nomadic tribe who proceed between all of the towns of the Red Wall and gather a sort of indigenous consciousness of their own. And we in the South just go between London and other metropoles. It's just bollocks.
I mean,
it's such crap.
I live in Liverpool, and yet I am more familiar with London and Paris than I am with Lancaster.
Right, which is, not so far off from being within sight by northern standards.
It also kind of reminds me of, I remember this very revealing line that Jacob Rees-Mogg once said. He said how, average voters are sick of cappuccino drinking metropolitan liberals. And I just sort of thought how, like, the whole Costa and Nero revolution has sort of passed them by.
Yeah.
In that cappuccino is probably the most popular drink among quote unquote ordinary people than anything else.
It's this idea of kind of the North as a sort of place where, you know, people being like, I only like my builder's tea with 12 sugars. Like, a kind of, you know, it's people who've got their idea of the North from watching kind of Ken Loach films 40 years ago.
Dylan Moran characterised it as people who throw darts at their pies.
Yeah, there you go.
Right,
anyway, we should talk about America.
Okay. So we're 2 weeks out from the election. Both national and swing state polls continue to be worryingly tight.
Mm-hmm.
My first question is, how did a well-known grifter with a long history of racist language, who was found liable to have committed rape, as well as committing other felonies, who was arguably the worst president in American history, whose mishandling of COVID led to hundreds of thousands of deaths, and who led an attempted insurrection against the Constitution of the United States, become a viable contender for re-election?
So I'd say a few things. Firstly, what it really is that he never stopped being one. It's not that he regained his status as a viable one. It's that no one demonstrated that he was definitively going to lose, or that he could conceivably lose the nomination. It just never came onto the scales. There hasn't actually been a break in that. But to the deeper point, his presidency was awful for a lot of people, but it wasn't awful for everyone. If you were in what is actually a relatively common life world in the US of you have at least one decent income into a family where you own your home, you own a car, you are not going to be losing your home or losing your car or losing either of your jobs anytime soon. Your kids are doing well in school or are going to college or are grown up and have gone away. You live in an area where most people either agree with you or you get along and you don't really know what they think about politics. You experienced the Trump presidency, and I'm talking largely about white Americans here, but not exclusively at all. You experienced the Trump presidency until COVID as a time of no obvious detriment to your standard of living, possibly even improvement, mainly in gas prices. Whether or not you can fairly chalk that up to him is just not relevant to how people think. Secondly, a lot of people in the US who went through COVID genuinely experienced it again as, I'm safe in my suburban home. It is affecting already dangerous, already unhealthy neighborhoods of people who are not like me in faraway parts of the country. I live in a red or reddish state where masking requirements and vaccine requirements are loose at best. So I can just go about my life. You know, I'll see my friends outside, maybe to being on the safe side, but it's okay. To the extent you get any news, you get it from Fox. And Trump himself, if you combine him with that experience, is a clown. If someone who tried to present themselves as respectable and normal, if, I don't know, Nikki Haley behaved like Trump, or if Vance behaved like Trump, people would reject it immediately. Because he is self-evidently crazy, visually, vocally, mentally, politically, he is chaotic and all over the place. A lot of normal people do not believe he actually means it. The things he's been criminally convicted of so far are grubby personal dealings that don't affect them. They might not like it, but that doesn't mean they care. I think a lot of people blame the January 6th rioters for January 6th, not him, because, you know, a lot of people in the US and a lot of people who vote Republican in particular believe fundamentally in the idea of personal responsibility, individualism. I think they're more likely to care that people are getting unfair sentences too long after the actual event, that maybe it would be healthier to kind of let it go. I think they don't know about the intricacies of the legal malfeasance after the vote. And I think also, we all resolve cognitive dissonance and get past our worries in various ways by saying it's probably going to be fine. And the truth is, for most people who voted for him before, it probably is going to be fine if he wins. Until they get pregnant and don't want to be, until they get swept up in mass deportation, because it's not just going to target illegal immigrants, it will target legal ones, until take your pick. But as far as it feels looking at this, for a lot of them, they remember it being basically fine, except for COVID, which they think was not really his fault. Also, one thing we forget in the UK about COVID is people in the US have a much keener sense often of what their state government is doing than of what the federal government is doing. And they don't necessarily see the interface between them for what it is, who is providing the money versus who is making the decision is not always clearly drawn. But they do have a whole layer of government that we do not experience. So Trump, there is a lot of layering between people and Trump himself for them to take issue with. And then he seems so unserious that when they hear something that kind of would yank them up if it came from someone who they think meant it, it's just noise. It's a bit silly. That is how I would say it.
Something I've been wondering about is, sort of infamously, Trump once said that he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and people would still support him. And I've been wondering if that would be true whoever the Republican candidate is. Like, such is the degree of polarization in America that the polls would be tight right now, regardless who is the candidate. All that would be different is the media narrative. So if Ron DeSantis was the candidate, the media narrative would be, you can have Trumpism without Trump. And if Nikki Haley was the candidate, the narrative would be Republicans can be competitive if they move back to the center. But really, it's such is the even divide between Democrats and Republicans that it kind of doesn't necessarily matter who the candidate is. The polls right now would still be tight.
I mean, I think it's hard to separate from the fact that no one else really would say that. You don't get to the point where you can run a primary campaign that anyone will notice saying those things, generally. A presidential primary campaign, anyway. Unless you are Trump, who was very well known as a volatile, gross, dodgy person before he ran.
Although my point isn't so much kind of as you said, that if another Republican candidate said the things Trump would say, it wouldn't play. My point is more, would
it be this close?
Well, yeah. Basically, all that would be different is the media narrative, whoever the candidate was.
I think that would be different, because there is a lot of talk at the moment, and I do share the fact that this is a really serious issue the media needs to address. There is a lot of talk at the moment among American journalists that the press is not covering Trump's craziness and dangerousness as the lead story about him enough. That is a problem. The question of why, I think people are quick to say, it's hard to conclude that the New York Times isn't in the tank for Trump. It's not in the tank for Trump. Editors and to-a-degree reporters are bored of him being crazy and are forgetting that a lot of people don't see it that often and don't hear from him that often. So it's left out for different reasons than people being nice to him. I don't think it would be automatically as close, whoever the Republican candidate was, or how nasty they were, partly because you can argue how much the polls are a function of media narrative permeating the electorate. It's probably exaggerated how much it does, but as you say, the narrative would be different. that person would have to spend a lot more time than Trump does defending themselves. And if they defended themselves ineffectively, it would make things worse for them. Whereas Trump barely bothers to defend himself. When he does, tends to be even more offensive. So the story keeps going and then gets old. I think your point about polarization is very true. I think there are probably very few people who are choosing between the two. I think more the issue is what people are choosing whether or not to vote. Because again, don't forget, most Americans in 50 odd states know that their votes probably don't make a difference unless they vote for the winner. Their vote just is irrelevant. We have a similar problem. It's just broken down into more areas with a smaller electorate. But so the number of people that this says anything about is quite small. I don't think Vance would be remotely competitive against Kamala or indeed Biden, because people would take it seriously, or people would say he's lying, and why would you lie about that? Why would you lie to make yourself seem harsher toward women when you know they don't want that? It didn't work for Ron. I mean, the reason Ron DeSantis didn't win the primary or didn't do better isn't just because Trump did so well and the base love him. It's because he's not very good. He is, by all accounts, very good at grasping policy. He is not stupid, but he is extremely bad at dealing with people in public. Where Trump is sort of smirkingly cruel, Ron is just cruel. Ron is just an unhappy bully. Trump is a nasty clown. And then you can go home and get on with your life having dipped in for a bit. Ron will actually shout at children at press conferences. One of the effects of the Trump thing, and it happened here with Corbyn to a degree, or could have happened with Corbyn if the wrong people had jumped ship, is that they have not nurtured a good enough bench of normal people who can just move on, because everyone has had to either pledge loyalty to him or become like him or leave. So if Trump were to vanish tomorrow and someone were to show up and just run a nice campaign, it would probably be someone no one had ever heard of. And it would be probably someone who didn't have huge fundraising connections, didn't have a base within the party. They've cut off an avenue to growth there. I think, however, that it's not the case that the electorate would then go kind of 75-25 to keep this person out. It's just that it would be enough to really push them away. And it happened with Romney after 2012. They did their infamous kind of autopsy on how to, win votes from Hispanic Americans and how to get younger people voting for them again. The reason I think Romney lost is he just was not that good. He wasn't particularly good at it. He didn't meet people where they were. He didn't seem like someone He didn't seem like he was bothering to earn anyone's vote. He seemed to feel like he was entitled to win, and the election was an inconvenience. Surprise, surprise, he didn't win. They also had a problem with their data was quite seriously wrong, and they thought they would win, and it was much worse than the problem Hillary had in 2016. So to your question, there is too much about Trump that is particular to him to make me think anyone could achieve this level of success polling-wise while behaving that way. No one else behaves like him without being utterly repellent while being a bit too normal for comfort. Put it that way. It's all right to be this awful if you're a freak and smirk while you're doing it. It's different to be this awful and look like Vance.
Although I'm loath to give him credit, is Trump a good strategist?
No. Doesn't mean people around him are not good strategists. It's not just that he's not a good strategist. He isn't a strategist. There is no evidence that he thinks in terms of strategy at all. I think what he may be very good at is identifying people who can and outsourcing it to them and go where they tell him to go, because he can't be bothered with it. He's too lazy to think about it. He knows he can blame them if it doesn't work, because he'll never blame himself. If you look at Bannon, and if you look at Roger Stone, and if you look at Stephen Miller, they are also completely transactional people as far as Trump's concerned. They view him as a device, not as someone they love or someone they completely believe in. He is achieving the thing they struggled to achieve. He's the thing that translates their strategy into an actual campaign. But that's partly because he does not counter them with strategy of his own. Everything for him is emotional, and it's all about himself. So it's therefore kind of not strategic by definition, I would argue. But that doesn't mean, I think people tend to hear Trump say stupid and crazy things and see him behave in ways that you would never tell a candidate to behave, and think, well, he's not making any serious calculations here, therefore the Trump movement is a stupid one. Clearly not so. He won once, he very nearly won again. He could very well win in 2 weeks' time. It's not an accident.
You've kind of touched on this, but it is the reason why he was able to outmaneuver so many quote-unquote experienced politicians was that basically under the Bush years, the Republican bench was just hollowed out in terms of any big figures.
I don't think it was hollowed out. I think two things happened. The financial crisis happened, and having rich people run the country on a kind of trickle-down, we know best, you'll be fine, cut your taxes basis made no sense anymore. And people forget how much the Republican Party of Bush was defined by a belief that corporate America succeeding would make everyone richer. It just was. And a lot of people believe that because a lot of people work for these companies. It's forgotten that, obviously it is awful and very striking how much wealth is concentrated in a fraction of 1% of the population. But an enormous percentage of the population work for large companies and are not poor. So they don't believe that these places are running things into the ground. But the 2008 crash changed that, because it wasn't just that they had fucked it up, it's that it was, malfeasance that had done it, and they were not going to be penalised. Secondly, with Sarah Palin as the sort of the person who created the permission structure for it, as elevated by McCain, you had the first 2 years of Obama. You saw kind of a new party within a party being created, with a lot of help from outside money, but kind of creating itself, doing an incredible job in the 2010 midterm cycle of displacing people in primaries, because the Tea Party base looks quite a lot like the Trump base from 2016, in that they were older, they had time, they were very online. There's a brilliant political scientist at one of the Ivies called Theda Skocpol. She did a study of who are the Tea Party in, I think, about 2011. And one of the points she made was that if you look at their Facebook groups and chain emails, because other social media wasn't really around then in the same way it's now, Tea Party people referred to legislation by bill number when they talk to each other. And she said the only other people who do this are legislative staff and political scientists. That Tea Party people do not refer to, the supplemental for funding a surge in Iraq in 2007-8. They would refer to, HR 106. And they were extremely knowledgeable about how it all worked. And the mainstream of the party kind of couldn't cope with that. This lot would be able to get 200 people to a school board meeting and take it over. So the party was kind of taken over by part of itself that did have its own electorate, who were able to mount primary campaigns. And if you look at the 2012 election, the 2012 primary, sure, Romney won the primary, but before him, you had Michelle Bachmann, briefly for about a week, but briefly at the top of the field, completely out there. You had Herman Cain, that we can just have, just set all tax brackets at 9% and everything will be fine. I know because I used to run a chain of pizza restaurants. You had Newt Gingrich, famously nuts, running in quite a Trumpy way on kind of intellectualized cruelty and cultural grievance, but again, like Trump, doing it with a bit of a smile. You have Rick Perry, who ran an ad saying there is an attack on Christians because gays are openly allowed to serve in the military, but our children can't celebrate Christmas in school. I think there was one more, and then they got back round to Romney because the others were just not quite good enough. They went a bit too far, or proved to be too out of their depth and didn't attract enough money just to win it. Romney kind of won it by default and tried to run a campaign of trust the guy who has made all this money for himself in America. He wants you to do the same. And no one did trust him, really. A lot of people voted against Obama, but no one cares about Mitt Romney or cared about that version of Mitt Romney. So with Trump, they had someone who was spectacular enough that he could beat even people running on that kind of platform. Rick Perry ran again, completely trivialized within weeks. Rubio ran again, tried to be, you can be swaggering and very right-wing, but serious. No one bought it. Little Marco. And he just wasn't convincing. Trump sets the bar for himself so low that the first thing you hear that you agree with, you're immediately on his side. The others are all boring, fake, a bit suspect, nothing to do with a normal person's life. So I think
arguably weird.
Weird, but weird without being interesting. Vance is weird, and you get the sense that the more you know, the worse it will get. Rubio is weird, but the more you know, the less is there. Really, he has studied up to be like this. And when you get down to it, he's just someone who wanted to be in politics. There's not much more there. Trump's psychology is so bizarre that its vacuity is kind of mysterious and intriguing. And the fact that you can never quite work out why he's doing what he's doing or why he's saying what he's saying is attractive in a way that, Marco Rubio likes the idea of being in power, can't quite work out how far he's allowed to go with the nasty stuff. And it's not clear why, who he thinks a Rubio voter is. Who could possibly care about that? What's the story there?
I do wonder if the reason why the weird jibe stung Trump so much is that he knows that these guys are weird. Yep. He doesn't believe he himself is weird. He thinks he's
just a New York guy.
Yeah.
Just the best one.
And so to be sort of put in the same box with a J.D. Vance, with a Marco Rubio, with a Rick Santorum, who would probably even give him
He's the one I forgot from 2012. Yeah. He's the one I forgot. Who won Iowa, I believe. Won a couple of the early states. He kind of took the Huckabee slot.
Did he come
2012.
Did he come second in 2016?
No. He did run, but in 2016 so many of them ran that they devoured each other. They kind of blended into one, rather proving the point about Trump that it was hard for them to... you did have people like Chris Christie, but he was just too liberal for them. They just didn't... he was not selling what their primary electorate believe in. That, and he also was manifestly corrupt with the whole Bridgegate thing. But I'd forgotten about Rick Santorum, blessedly. No, I think Trump probably considers Vance weird and lame. Campaigns with him noticeably rarely. Will hate the fact that Vance polls extremely badly. Will resent the fact that Vance was basically forced on him because he needed money and Peter Thiel and Musk would give it to him, and Trump Jr. is very enamoured of him and kind of talked him into it, and it's turned out to be a really bad move. He's adding nothing and detracting quite a bit. But I also think what would really frustrate Trump would be to have someone on the ticket who was more popular than him. That would be completely intolerable for him.
I mean, I imagine it's a in a way it's a paradox of sort of. I imagine the idea of having a running mate is offensive to Trump because the idea that someone will replace him is inconceivable to him.
You say that, but what you also get with a running mate is someone to go around the country on your behalf and say how amazing you are. And you have someone who has accepted that they are not challenging you. They consider themselves lucky to be in second place behind you. There's a certain sort of, I don't know, a shark looks bigger with those tiny fish swimming alongside it. There's an element of that with him.
So I imagine he's always had that in business.
Of minions.
Yeah,
it's the feeling of minions. It's how he views his children.
But the difference this time is that there is a constitutional requirement that if he dies, the other person takes over. And I imagine that's something psychologically he can't quite.
I think he probably just switches that off. I don't think he thinks in depth about the future except in terms of staying out of prison, making money, and winning. I don't think he contemplates really anything. Maybe he ruminates over things, but I think those are more matters of resentment and, again, the difference between tactics and strategy. What is the way he gets out of every legal thing? Delaying it. Not by actually grappling with it and trying to rework it in his favour, by delaying it or appointing someone to a court who will throw it out. Not by getting it right and having a plan. And to the extent that they have approached any of these things in a strategic way, he has clearly not been involved in formulating what the strategy was. So, yeah, I think if anything's keeping him up at night, it's, I can't possibly lose this to a black woman, can I? And how can she call herself black when she doesn't look black? And she has an Indian name. She must be a fake. Everyone will agree with me.
She mustn't have worked at McDonald's.
She can't have worked at McDonald's. But the McDonald's thing is an interesting story because they clearly believe, I'm on both campaigns' kind of generic mailing lists just to see what comes into the email. The Trump lot are pushing the McDonald's thing really hard. I think they think it tells you something about a lot of the voters they're appealing to, because no one who has actually worked a job like McDonald's to support themselves while studying to become a professional ever thinks they will put it on a CV. You just don't. In any country, you don't. The Trump people are appealing to people who have done so well they've never had to work a job like that, or to people who work in McDonald's and are proud of it because they have a job and or they own a franchise or whatever. They are not appealing to people who have gone from middle class and lower middle class to college to become lawyers in a coastal city. That's not the path of person they're after. The other thing is that they believe, I would think probably justifiably, that a lot of their voters will be in such a bubble, be it Fox, be it whatever similar, that they will genuinely think the McDonald's story is engulfing her, and it's the scandal of the campaign, and it proves that she's a fake, and it proves she's a phony, and everyone agrees on this. They similarly, a lot of them believe that Tim Walz has been a disaster, and that the exaggerating how many times he's been to China and using the term IVF as a generic term for fertility treatment when he and his wife used, I think it's IUI, when it is not a meaningful distinction for most people. I think a lot of people in the Trumpy media bubble, voters in that bubble, really have a different narrative of the campaign in their heads. And they think these people are collapsing because it's been proven that they've lied about normal aspects of life, which isn't the case.
Yeah, I've been wondering if they're probably on the Republican side with Republican voters, there probably was some juice in that McDonald's story.
Mm-hmm.
However, the stunt yesterday at the McDonald's, he looks so bad.
Awful.
And awful. So diminished.
Well, you could tell he'd been put there. You could tell that he did not go, I'm going to go and spend a day working at McDonald's to prove I get it, or to prove I'm not above it, or to prove that I believe in people working at McDonald's. Someone said, she's in trouble for this McDonald's thing, so we're sending you to McDonald's for the day. And he said, fine. And he just was, waited to be told what to do, did it. It doesn't help that he never laughs. Notoriously, there's sort of almost no video of him laughing from the last 10 years or 12 years.
But also, there was no branding either? No Trump branding?
Nothing. It was very, very botched.
So I just felt he looked diminished in that little pinny. And
But the question is, who was the audience?
But I feel it will turn off that audience by diminishing him.
I think there will be people who think he's impressive and will think that was embarrassing, but there will also be people who will think the fact that it was really embarrassing proves that he's ready to be humble, and that the idea that he's grandiose and sees himself as a king isn't fair. I think there will be people who view it that way. There's another element to it, though, of the Kamala lied on her CV side of the McDonald's story, which is so stupid, which is that it is a racist thing. It is this idea that black success has to be explained. And that if there's any indication that a successful black American has not been completely straight about every single step they've taken in their life, they're shifty. And what do you expect? And it is the same standard that was applied particularly to Michelle Obama. This idea that there's a political scientist in the US called Melissa Harris Perry, who was an MSNBC host for a while, but she's still in academia. And I saw a talk by her where she said the reaction to Michelle Obama's Princeton thesis, her undergrad thesis, which was basically about the experience of being a high-achieving college student at an Ivy League university and coming from a black family on the south side of Chicago and being seen as someone who came from one. It was all about, Du Boisian double consciousness. This woman said the reaction against that thesis as somehow extreme was because a lot of white Americans cannot conceive of someone coming up from the south side, in quotation marks, getting to Princeton and being anything other than incredibly grateful. And it's similar with Harris. Shouldn't you be honest about who you are, that you were someone who worked at McDonald's, that you didn't just get here on your own? If Tim Walz had worked put it this way, I don't know whether or not Tim Walz worked a job when he was in his late teens to put himself through college, because they are not looking into it. Because they're not checking whether a white man was once a bartender or once, pick your crap job, whatever it is. They only care because they do not give black people, and especially not black women, any room for error. The fact that it's McDonald's only adds to the sort of, what do you expect from this urban, she was at Howard, so she was at a black university, and there she was, handing out really unhealthy, greasy food in a black neighborhood. And what do you know? She lied about it because she doesn't want to seem like what she really is. It is a classic racist double standard and an impossible standard that someone's being held to.
I mean, another aspect is Jamel Bowie, the New York Times columnist. He made the point that that the mainstream political media in the US, and I'd also say to some extent in the UK as well, has decided that Harris is stupid. She doesn't really know anything about anything. She gives these rambling answers to questions, but then also are constantly surprised at her mastery over policy detail, her political skill, the fact that she's achieved something in the last 2-3 months that I don't think has ever been done in American politics. Mm-hmm. And that, again, that there is just this, also just kind of overlooking at how extensive her political career is. And not only just any political career, but like one in which she was sort of reared in a really brutal, internecine San Francisco and California politics, where she knows how to handle a knife politically.
Yeah.
But there's just this idea of, this average politician.
She can't possibly deserve this.
Yeah.
I think that part of it was, I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think it's less that they've decided she's stupid. Obviously, I think people on the hard right have definitely decided she's stupid and definitely think that that's the most hurtful way to attack her without actually saying explicitly racist things. I think that's true. I think a lot of the others say have decided that she's a disappointment and decided that she had never lived up to her potential, that to the extent the Biden lot had tried to use her for anything, she'd fumbled it, that she was, she's easily wrong-footed in interviews, she's prickly when brought up on things, she doesn't like being challenged. And I think, in fairness to her, while it is true that she has previously given some very bad interviews before this campaign, and that she became clearly a bit more media careful after them, that's a completely rational response. Also,
every politician
that
does.
Everyone would embrace. The other thing is, there were lots of stories about working for her is awful, working for her campaign was awful. Very, very much the same Hillary story. This idea that either a woman can't run an orderly campaign, or she is a bully and harsh and a sort of school mom, and everyone leaves crying because they're emotionally abused. Now, there are such things as female bullies in politics. There isn't really any evidence that that's what Kamala Harris is, and no one is asking, what is it like to work for J.D. Vance? No one's checking what it's like. Whereas they are investigating her. What is every single detail of who in her office experiences?
I'd say also there's the grace that is extended to male politicians who've had bad previous campaigns.
Yeah,
is not extended to Harris for her 2019 campaign.
Yeah,
the fact that Biden has had so many failed presidential campaigns is not
badly failed.
Yeah,
failed.
Is not something that is repeatedly brought up both to him and in the reporting. The fact that Romney had a bad campaign in 2008 wasn't then held against him in 2012 necessarily, or it's it's a key point in any profile of Harris about this bad 2019 campaign, and therefore she isn't really eligible for 2024.
I think one thing that hamstrings her and again, I think it's a bit of a media failing. It's not a failing on her part, but one thing that leaves her even more vulnerable to this is that her minus 4 years in the Senate, she was elected in 2016, I believe, that her career was not national. So the depth of a deep dive you would have been able to do on Elizabeth Warren, who by the time she ran in 2020 had been a national figure since before Obama. You know, she hadn't been an elected figure for that whole time, but she had been nationally known for a long time. You're going into the weeds of Californian, the regulation of tech companies, or rather not even the regulation of the enforcement of that regulation. You're going into intrastate justice proceedings that most people who will have been assigned the job of writing profiles of her have not followed and don't know well. And so using them as indications of her ability and character is a big game of catch up. They don't have points of reference. They don't know who she worked with or for most of the time. They don't know what being a DA in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, actually entails in terms of how skillful you have to be, who you're dealing with, what your job is. They don't know what running for AG in California is actually like. It doesn't help that there's this assumption that California Senate races are really, really uncompetitive, and why pay any attention to them after the primary, which isn't really true. So she didn't arrive with a kind of Wikipedia entry that will have read familiarly to people who wrote the profiles of her that a lot of the subsequent reporting will have been based on. And that is there's an element of laziness, there's an element of the fact that journalists' time is increasingly compressed and their resources are squeezed, and a lot of them would rather be the person to get the first big interview with her than write a piece about the interview she's previously done. I am a journalist. I know what people in my position want to be seen as having achieved. It is not writing about what someone did 7 years ago and the fact that they did it well. That's not the job that you were sold when you were being... And also in the US, this is particularly important because the ethic of journalism in the US, be it on the right, be it on the left, is much more vocational than it is here. And it involves much more extended and much more expensive formal training. And they view themselves much more in terms of how much shoe leather reporting have you done and how sharp a question can you ask at a press conference. That in the UK is really confined now to the lobby in Westminster. It's not really how online newsrooms in the UK work. Investigative stuff in the UK is very big, but a lot of it is done at a desk. In the US, you have 6 months to write a 6,000 word profile of someone, and you have a fact checker go through it for you, and you spend ages with the subject of it, and you follow them around a bit. We don't really bother. We're much lazier. So when journalists in the US don't have access to someone who is the likely next president, and they have to just write about her, it's very frustrating for a lot of them. Not all of them. And some of that resentment will end up directed at her, and it will end up manifested in coverage questioning her, thus challenging her to open up more, hopefully to them. They may not know they're doing this, some of them. And I think actually the frustration is a lot more probably at the level of the editor rather than the reporter or the writer. But editors will be sitting in news meetings saying, I want a piece about why she hasn't done more interviews, and I want you to go back and look at her previous behaviour to see if it's something she's avoiding as a matter of course, and then to investigate why. Because in lieu of an interview with her, that's the most interesting piece we can do right now. And everyone knows Trump is crazy, so why bother with him?
I think there are exceptions of, there's a really good long read in the FT by Joshua Chaffin about Harris's career in California and San Francisco. Mm-hmm. And there's a really good line I liked in it, which is, in a single party city, all wars are civil wars.
Yep.
And it takes talent to break through and tenacity to survive.
Yeah.
However, I think they're the exceptions too. I think a lot of UK journalists, and especially, political journalists and lobby journalists, take most of their opinions about American politics from those main reporting things like New York Times, the Washington Post, and they basically just take those reports, those columns, uncritically, and then repackage it. So, like we were talking before we started recording, that the FT's Henry Mance on Blue Sky described Harris as average, and how the Democrats should have chosen someone from the Midwest or the Rust Belt, which absolutely infuriated me, because firstly, how you can look at anything about Harris and describe it as average, I can't fathom. But also, it's the most boring, hackneyed take on the election that is just so removed from the context of the actual election that is happening.
Well, and also, if you look at the last primary, the last Democratic primary, you might ask yourself whom anyone can remember having run. You know, there were 20-ish, 20 plus if you include some people that got absolutely no coverage, but there were about 20 people who ran. Biden won it. Bernie could have won it. Getting to the last handful were Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, who effectively won the Iowa caucus, although they fucked it up so badly we'll never know, and Amy Klobuchar, female senator from Minnesota. There was a tide of white men from the middle of the country who made not a dent in the whole thing. Pete is interesting because he came from nowhere, is an uncommonly good speaker, extremely smart and gay, and was in the military. So Pete has a lot to him that is not average. Amy Klobuchar is very clever and very experienced, but it was not as if she was about to win the primary. Warren, I think, would have done an enormous lot better if Bernie hadn't run. But if you line up that final five, you are rather missing an average white man with mass appeal, except for Biden. And Biden is not actually a particularly typical person. He is dramatically older, for a start. He had been vice president for 2 terms with Obama. He has had a very long career and is very familiar to a lot of people. There isn't really another one like him coming down the path on their side who is likely to run for president. I'm guessing that the guy you mentioned to get into this, if you look at, Gretchen Whitmer, who removed herself from being chosen for vice president. So never mind should they have picked someone like her. She didn't want to run. Gretchen Whitmer is a very impressive person on paper. And by that I don't mean she's not actually impressive. If you were to read about her, you'd be very convinced. She's not a very good speaker. She does not present well off script. She's kind of dorky, and not in a Tim Walz fun dad way, in a not as funny as she thinks way. I think she will...
She was recently on Andy Cohen's Watch What Happens Live, which I don't know if you've seen.
No.
So it's very... Imagine the Graham Norton show.
I know the one you mean.
Yeah, compressed into about 20 minutes with various silly games.
I remember this.
And she was all right, but she wasn't it wasn't a star waiting to be born.
Yeah, and I think the thing he's also not taking into account with that tweet is, is his argument they need someone more spectacular than her, or is his argument she's not good enough, but if she were good enough, she'd be the right person? Or is his argument you need someone who can appeal to the maximum number of people, which immediately falls down because of the number of states in which this thing is being fought. The states concerned are very varied, but there are really only 7, and I do still think it's possible that either she or Trump will win a state that absolutely no one is currently talking about. there was a poll putting her 4 points behind him in Iowa. It is not impossible that he could win New Hampshire. It is not impossible that she could win the floating congressional district in Maine. It's very unlikely, but it's not impossible. However, in lieu of that, everything comes down to 7 states, 2 of which you could really count as the Midwest. So the idea that you need someone from the Midwest who's above average in order to win Nevada and North Carolina, I sort of don't understand. I also think she has dramatized it somehow. She provides a story that she's lent into and she has embraced. She's not running some workmanlike respectability campaign about, I am someone you can trust and I am sound and I'm, fiscally mindful and everything. She's running a campaign based on charisma that happens to be someone who also is very competent, very knowledgeable and very experienced. I would consider that getting it the right way round. The amount of money she's pulled in is to some degree an indicator of the fact that people who are relevant care in a way that they didn't 6 months ago. That's big donors and its voters. That money continues to come in. I don't see what the criticism of her as average means other than that he doesn't get it.
David Gork wrote a piece about why British conservatives shouldn't root for Trump. Mm-hmm. And he also said that he hasn't been impressed by Harris. And again, I'm thinking explain to me how you haven't been impressed. That within a few months, after years in which the underlying assumption and all the campaign planning was that this would be a Biden-Trump do-over. And within a few months, she firstly secures the nomination completely smoothly.
Within days. Within 2 weeks.
Without any sounding off, without any criticisms, everyone on board gets a ton of money from donations, gets huge amount of media attention, then completely sails through every big set piece moment.
Yeah.
With really good oratorical speeches.
Yep.
Then destroys Trump at the one debate, something that every single Democratic politician has been terrified of. Yeah. And even Hillary Clinton struggled to deal with Trump in a debate. Mm. And yet, from beginning to end, Harris monstered him.
Yeah.
And so it is it feels to me it says more about these people that they are unimpressed by Harris.
I agree
than
with
Harris
you.
herself.
I agree with you. I think it indicates a lack of interest in who the audience is for a lot of this. They came in after the Biden thing thinking, yes, he was polling south of 40%, but he still had that 38%, who are the at minimum 12 who could be here and are not yet. They are younger. They live in cities. They don't believe that he's going to improve things for minimum wage workers. They don't believe that he's moved fast enough on, whether it's Gaza, whatever. Not that they've all come to her. That's a whole other story. People like David Gork and Henry Mance don't really think in terms of that voting bloc. They think about what do people like them want. So the idea that she could go on Call Her Daddy and hold a very, very impressive interview, both in terms of grasp of detail and just obviously genuine empathy, and do it for an hour without script, isn't impressive to them because they don't understand that audience matters, because it's not like them. One thing that I heard about the Harris campaign's social media operation, which immediately was incredibly effective. Someone I saw found as many people as they could on LinkedIn who are working for that team. I don't think they're running it, but working for it. Their average year of graduation from college is 2020. That instead of hiring people to run focus groups of young people and then emulate the results, they have just hired young people. And it's working. And the speed with which they're able to clip something, turn it around and share it and get hundreds of thousands of views on a platform where they are probably on X, where they are probably being actively suppressed by Elon. And I wouldn't be surprised if he just bans one of her accounts the week before the election, the way he's going now. That is not the world that David Gork and Henry Mance live in. It's not necessarily the world I live in, but at least I know it's there and that it matters. What they're saying is, she doesn't impress me in the way Obama did. She doesn't impress me in the way Bill Clinton did. She doesn't seem, insert your name-esque. And it's hard to argue she's less impressive than Biden, given the last 6 months. So I don't understand the standard they're applying. Whichever way you slice it, she's polling more than 10% better than Biden was when he's dropped out. She gets credit for that, in my book. And I don't understand why you would withhold credit for that from her.
We're currently in what MSNBC's Hayes Brown calls the uncanny valley of the election. Mm-hmm. The polls haven't really changed since Harris slightly overtook Trump in the summer. Mm-hmm. Yet many Democrats are worrying about the vibes being off. Yep. What's your view?
I think it would be irresponsible not to be concerned, whatever the polling said. I think there is a lot of traumatic memory from 2016 that will never go away. And I think that's a good thing for them. It has been memory hold. How ubiquitous in 2016 the belief was that Hillary was going to win. A lot of outlets did not commission pieces reflecting on Trump winning and Hillary losing. I worked at one. I was responsible for that mistake. But quite a few places had the same experience of having to write them in the UK early in the morning or reverse the one they had because it was not seen coming. And that's partly because, and the fact that his margin of victory in the Electoral College was what it was, validates to a large degree people's surprise at it. But what they have done is learnt that you cannot for a minute take anything for granted or think that it will be all right on the night. I think that they have an obvious strategic interest in trying to make people who were incredibly euphoric a month ago feel like it's on them, not Kamala, to make sure Kamala wins. And that is, again, seeing all the emails they send out, the messaging they're directing to their voters who are signed up, who can either give them a little bit of money or go out canvassing or phone banking. The message they're directing to them is of impending disaster. It's not just, we need to close the deal. It's, here is an example of a poll released today from a credible pollster that puts us 1 point behind nationally. This is an emergency. And not, crucially, not it's an emergency because of how dangerous Trump is. An emergency because we might lose. Implicit in that is, it will to some extent be your fault if you don't help. I think that is part of what is informing the coverage. Because people need something new to write about, besides the fact that she's really good. The polling provides evidence for that, but the truth is that the polling since the summer has been, whether it be at the state level, whether it be national, has basically been within the margin of error all along. And the polling also only includes likely voters or registered voters, who are not everyone who will vote, and not all of them will vote. So it's by definition crude and murky, but it's the only substrate that you can write about and tell yourself you're writing about actual evidence rather than conjecture. so journalists have to use it. This, I think, is helpful for her campaign because all the evidence is that female voters of all ages, but particularly younger ones, are extremely well informed about what has happened to reproductive rights and what is likely to happen. That they are organising very effectively. All the ballot measures that have happened prior to this election about abortion, including in quite conservative states, have gone in the direction of reproductive rights, I think. I may be wrong about that, but it has been very striking how they have been won from the ground up. And this election is basically another one. Leave aside the fact that there are such measures in Arizona, Montana, I think there are one or two others. Creating a sense that the election is on a knife edge is crucial to making sure people bother with it.
Mm. I mean, you don't want the what happened with Labour.
No,
even though they did win massively, but
well, I think what you really don't want is a lot of. This is what it's also doing. Is it is drawing out now. Again, this is probably some of this is driven by editors rather than reporters. It is drawing out stories about how is the campaign fucking it up. How are they getting it wrong? Why aren't they deploying Tim Walz better? Why? Take your pick of unfalsifiable theory of loss. It's drawing them out now. Some people will, I think, in the campaign will be saying the journalists will be bored of writing this when there's only a week to go. So let's have it when there are 2 or 3 weeks to go. And there will just not be anything more in the tank if we don't screw it up further for them to write about. Because notice in all of this coverage about, why are they not running away with it? Why is the polling so even? No one can actually point to anything they've done wrong. None of these pieces are about, it was such a mistake to give that interview or not give that interview or do this or do that or do the other. It is just about vibe. David Brooks wrote an awful column in the New York Times the other day. I know you'll be shocked to hear me say that, which was, I think, headlined, "Why isn't she running away with this?" Now, he won't have written that headline, so let's put that to the side. And it basically came down to being a completely campaign-side explanation. It is not about the fact that a lot of people like Trump and will vote for him. And it is not about the fact that a lot of people don't switch on until very late, even though the stakes are incredibly high. It just, there's an election, it's next week, isn't it? Let's check it out. That's what's happening for a lot of people. It's the same in the UK, it's the same in most democracies. People have lives to get on with. Instead, that kind of explanation of, here is the polling and what it says, let's explain it, comes entirely down to this idea that that the job of a campaign is to sort of play the electorate like a musical instrument. And if it's not responding the right way, it's because they're not skilled enough. It's an entirely inaccurate analogy because the electorate has its own agency and people have their own lives, which the campaigns are not in charge of. Leave aside the fact that there are other external factors like an oil price spike if Iran gets nuked by Israel is an extreme example, or in 2008, the financial crisis, or in 2016, the Comey memo. Whatever. The idea that it's a failure of the campaign to dance the right dance, and people who vote for Trump or who don't vote, that their decision is just a factor of what the campaign did or didn't do, is just not an accurate explanation. In the last chapter of Hillary's post-2016 book, which is called What Happened, the last or penultimate chapter, she just does what comes close to a proper multi-causal hypothesis testing analysis of the result. And it says, was the result due to the number of people who've been struck off the voter rolls in Wisconsin? Was the result due to How did the polling change after the Comey memo came out? Was it about turnout among specific demographics and if we had done something to this? And she is very clear that there is no one thing that explains the loss on its own. Because the margin was so narrow, any of these things changing might have changed the outcome. You also can't prove that they would have changed the outcome. You never get that kind of depth of analysis in an op-ed. You just don't. It's not how the industry generally works. You tend to after the election, interestingly, but you tend not to get it in the heat of things because people need to have their elbow out to have something to say. It's something I try and avoid when writing, but I know that I fall into the same trap. I think the campaign are leaning into the idea it's slipping away from them to motivate people with panic and in some cases with a sense of responsibility. And they are doing it earlier rather than later. I think their messaging in the final days will be similarly urgent, but it won't be as negative about their chances, if I had to guess now. And I think there will be a return to euphoric performance. She's about to do this get out the vote gig with someone. I think it's Usher, surprise guest. But there is going to be a return to the spectacle that you got at the convention to draw a contrast with this parade of nastiness on the other side. But they have to get there through this to avoid the perception of hubris, which is what journalists would be writing about if they were pretending the polling were looking good for them.
Jamel Bouie's view is the race is evenly tied, but Trump is diminished and Harris is making a ploy for voters who are invisible to the media and to polls. And I guess that by diminished, I imagine he means that the Trump campaign is maybe out of juice. It's just kind of running on fumes now. Whereas Harris, whether financially, psychologically, logistically, has yet to really deploy its full strength, and it can do that in the next 2 weeks.
I think I can see an argument for that, but the way I would put it is we have not seen the entire Harris strategy unfold yet.
Unfortunately, there was a little bit more to mine and Andrew's conversation, but my auntie arrived, which set off my dogs, and the audio was just too bad to use. I tried to tempt Andrew into a prediction, but he refused. Still, I want to thank him again for sparing the time to talk to me. If you want more of his analysis on the election, subscribe to his great Substack, Memo from America. The link is in the show notes. Next week, film scholar and zaddy Paul Klein is back. We'll be deciding the top 10 films about American politics. Hope you tune in again next week.